Welcome, everybody, to Gospel Talks podcast, where we help Christians all over the world with relational evangelism and discipleship becoming more effective in it. And we're so excited to have Pastor Joel Mosier from the Houston, Texas area with us today. And this is the first of its kind podcast in Gospel Talks, in that we're bringing a pastor, one of our exchange trainers. I don't know if you guys know this, but Pastor Joel is one of those exchange trainers that can travel around to churches and do an exchange seminar in your church. And so it's good to have you on, Pastor.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been excited and looking forward to this.
Yeah. Well, I think the audience is excited to hear from somebody else besides me. So I think that's what's truly exciting here. Well, let me just start with this. Tell us your life story. How'd you end up in Houston? Go as far back as you want.
Sure. So I grew up in a pastor's home. And so my testimony goes, growing up in Sunday school, knowing the gospel, hearing the gospel, probably, having made a profession numerous times, but really not until I was 13 years old did I think I truly understood what it means to depend upon the righteousness of Christ alone. And then later on in those next, high school, teenage years, really began to consider what does God want me to do with my life? And my senior year in high school, just being absolutely overwhelmed with the desire to preach, and wherever that would be. I didn't know at the time that it meant to be a pastor. I just knew that I was to be a preacher. And so it really was during my college years that God really cemented that desire to just be a pastor. Whether, regardless the size of the congregation, I just wanted to be faithful with the sheep that God entrusted to me. And so I went through the normal, college, seminary, but then also becoming a youth pastor and then an associate pastor at the same church. And then finally, now 13 years ago, I came to Grace Life there in Northwest Houston. And even though I grew up in Wisconsin, I am now a Texan. And everyone is an adopted Texan in Texas. I don't think many of us actually grew up there. But the great thing about Texas, is you're official if you have cowboy boots. And I just went to the rodeo yesterday, so I was wearing my cowboy boots, and we're officially Texan. But no, we've been in Northwest Houston at Grace Life for 13 years. And I want to talk just how did God grow my heart specifically for personal evangelism? Go back to when I was a youth pastor fresh out of seminary. My very first home that we lived in, actually the first apartment that we lived in, was a couple that lived right across the hallway, and we began to figure out how were we going to meet with them. And I felt like it was like a toddler relationally, having grown up in a pastor's home, really kind of been insular in a Christian bubble, and yet knowing the responsibility to share the gospel. So that a first apartment complex, just awkward in all my interactions with unbelieving people. Our first home there in Tucson, Arizona. Across the street, I remember Gabe and his wife and having them into our house. And here I'm a 20-something-year-old, and here's a guy who's in his 50s, and being able to kind of awkwardly work through the gospel or conversationally. And it really was then that was 20-some years ago now that I used the exchange in its kind of beginning stages, that God began to work into my heart. What does it mean to build relationships for the gospel? And so then fast forwarding now into Cypress, Texas, where when I came to Grace Life, it was a revitalization situation with 20-some people that first Sunday. And now well over a decade now, having seen numerous people come to faith, specifically through the relationships of meeting families at the bus stop, coaching soccer teams, coaching basketball teams, first-time guests coming to Grace Life. And I could just numerous stories in between there of how God used a inadequate Christian, but having a desire, knowing that it's my responsibility, but not knowing always how the best way to approach it. So it really, God has kind of grown me relationally on what does it mean to build a relationship with unbelieving friends, and then begin to share the gospel using the exchange Bible study.
So I'm just curious a little bit, growing up in a pastor's home. I'm a pastor, but nobody in my family tree. I'm the first. My kids are growing up in a pastor's home. What was it like growing up in a pastor's home? Was that good or bad? Because I've heard some bad experiences from PKs. They call them PKs, pastors' kids.
I loved it.
Yeah,
I think it was great. Now I know I have other friends who are like, I would never do that, And I mean, looking back on it, there's times where I think, that church member shouldn't have said that, or maybe we're holding us to a higher standard than necessary. But man, I loved being on the front row of ministry. I loved seeing God work in people's lives. I loved seeing life change, and so. You can ask my parents, by far, they were not perfect, and neither were the churches, but I loved everything about it. I wouldn't change any of it. And we walked through, my parents have had the scars and the wounds of ministry life. And I've got the same bruises, now having been in pastoral ministry for 20 years, but it was nothing but positive for me.
Did you said you were a youth pastor for a while there. How long were you a youth pastor? How long were you an assistant pastor before you became senior pastor?
Yeah. So I actually was on staff at 2 churches.
Okay.
I was a youth pastor for 2.5 years in Tucson, Arizona, and absolutely loved those kids. And it was there actually that I was like, it really was like, okay, I am a pastor, because it was so heartbreaking when God moved us. And then I was for 6.5 years, I was a youth pastor for 4 of those years, and then I transitioned into the associate pastor role at the same church. Prior to becoming a lead pastor, I was in either youth pastoring or that associate role for a total of 9 years.
I mean, I assume that your favorite role so far has been the lead pastor. Is there something different, or do you look back on any one of those and be like, I hated that phase, but it was necessary? Or
no, here's the thing. I'm youthful. I know I'm older now, but I love teenagers. I love fist bumping guys in our lobby. I love asking them, how was work this past week? How was the test? I love, the high school girls in our church, did you go on a date this past week? Do I approve of them? I just love teenagers. And so I think being a youth pastor for, of those 9 years, I guess a total of 6.5 of them, that really helped me. So I loved every part. I wouldn't trade being a senior pastor for anything. This is exactly what God wired me to do, who he made me to be. But I look back on those youth pastor years with great fondness and love it.
It's really hard to reach teenagers for some churches. And there's a lot of sense in which there's a certain type of church that might even despise youth, or just look at teenagers with suspicion or just as all-out rebellion. So it's good to hear from a youth pastor who's had positive experiences with his teenager. How do churches reach teenagers?
Let me say this. I don't think there's any magic formula. Wear this style of clothing, do this style of hair, this style of music. I don't think it's anything of that. Here's what I think it is. I think if you love people where they're at, and you teach them the Bible, but you do it in a gracious, kind way, instead of talking down to them, speaking to them, acknowledging the difficulties of the passage, acknowledging how that would be difficult to live this way in this type of culture, and just recognizing that I'm on your side. And you know what? I'm going to be cheering you on. And when you fall down, it's okay. We're going to help you back up. Or we're going to celebrate that you got back up again. And I think teenagers, here's one thing teenagers instinctively know, are you legit? Are you genuine? And are you in this for me, or are you in this for yourself? And I think just having that kind of motivation check inside. And so teenagers respond to that. And so I still, George, in our community, the high schools are 4,000 kids apiece.
Wow.
And there's 3 high schools within 5 miles of us.
Wow.
By the way the crow flies, they're all 4,000. When I drive by them, I just pray, God, do an awakening work of your Spirit in the lives of our community. And I actually know that he is, and stories I have from teachers and things like that. But all that to say, it's just my heart for that God has given me for the next generation. And I think it's the next generation, right?
Yeah.
It's the generation that, hey, I'm a permanent interim pastor, and someday, God willing, one of those kids, one of those guys is going to be up here preaching the word. So how can I best encourage him so that this church has the next healthy pastor?
Well, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So tell us, what is a week in Pastor Joel's life, week to week ministry? What does a week in Pastor Joel's life look like?
Well, if it's college basketball season, make sure we include our Houston Cougars
there you
in
go.
there. A week in my life. Oh man, you really want me to just go like Monday? This is what I do, and
sure. I mean,
okay,
whatever you want to, whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we don't have a large staff. It's myself, our youth pastor, and I have a part-time secretary, right?
Mm-hmm.
So on Mondays, our youth pastor and I meet. We just talk about the highs and lows of what happened that past weekend. We pray. And so Mondays for me, light admin stuff where I'm exhausted from Sunday and having preached, and then also meetings on Sunday evenings with various church family members. Oh, man. Tuesdays for me are all day study. I lock myself I stay at my house that day, and I literally will study from the beginning to the end of the day.
Wow.
Yeah. So
how many hours? Like 10 hours of like.
Yeah. It's an 8 to 10 hour day.
Wow.
Yeah. And just do as much as I can. Try to get as much of that sermon prep done as early in the week as I possibly can. Wednesdays, I leave for the church family. I do more coffee and have lunches with men almost every week. Coffee for sure every week on Wednesday. I recently, here's something I've tried to start doing is just targeting who are our young men, below the age of 25. And making sure that I'm connecting with at least one of our young men once a week. So I keep track of who those men are, and it's just connecting, we pray together, or in some cases we're actually working through books together. And then I've got shut-in visits to do on Wednesday. So literally I can go from having coffee with a 20-something-year-old or eating Tex-Mex with a 20-something-year-old and then visiting a 92-year-old shut-in widow who is a member of our church, and I love her dearly. So that's what Thursday is my day off. Then Friday I get up at an ungodly hour. I get up super early, and just try to knock out my sermon.
Okay.
And finish it up, and then I'll head into church and finish up with meetings and visits and stuff like that on Friday, and Saturdays for whatever's planned, whether it's church or family. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. I love that. You're sitting down with somebody as young as 25, somebody as old as 92. I feel like some churches, they have one or the other demographic. And I always think that a healthy church, if I walk into a church, if I come away thinking it's healthy, it's because I feel like it's a solid reflection of the demographics of that community overall. And I feel like our churches need to be more reflective of the community. And if we're not, it means we're failing somewhere in outreach. I know one of the things the success and what's happening at your church is absolutely incredible. You guys are growing. You guys are getting ready to plant a church out of your church, which is super exciting. Reaching people in your neighborhood we were talking that a little bit before we came on the podcast, but you're actually reaching your neighbors. To me, like my neighbors, they click the garage door opener, they pull into the cul-de-sac, they drive into the garage, click the opener again. Yeah. And like, that's it. That's as much as I see some of my neighbors. Some of them are a little bit more friendly, but so how have you done it? How do you, in today's suburbia, how do you reach people that are so closed off?
Well, and here an additional factor to that is this as well. You mean you're living in Phoenix where it's hot,
right?
I'm living in Houston where it is blazing hot as well,
yeah.
Right. And so to your point, people hit the garage, go in, and it's like I want to hit the AC. The last thing I want to do is be out in this humidity, right? Mm-hmm. In Houston. I'll say this, we have 5 kids. Our oldest 3 are now young adults. Our youngest 2, high school and now middle school. It is, I will say this, it's a little bit more challenging as the kids get older, and it's less neighborhood focused as far as their activities. They're going to this ball game or this practice, and they're traveling for this event, driving to work for this. So there has to be greater intentionality. But having said that, I can just think of this right now. My wife and I had the privilege last November, December to lead our neighbors to the Lord.
Wow.
Completely different ages than us. They're brand new, starting life, having their first child and now children, but it's just being a good neighbor.
So tell me the story on that. I mean, how did that go start to finish? Like, what does that even look like?
Yeah. Here's how it is for us. It's, when we're out, Tara and I go on a walk after dinner, it starts off with a wave across the street. And then the intentionality continues with reaching out, walking over, introducing ourselves. For us in Houston, I don't know what it's like in other areas, but man, there's certain times of the year for us. Halloween is one of the best time to meet our neighbors. Our entire neighborhood is out. It's the craziest thing ever.
Is that where you met this couple? Like you got to know them at Halloween?
So that was kind of the, if I recall correctly, my wife would maybe be able to give greater detail than this, but I believe that was the initial conversation. Mm-hmm. And from there it was, where it went from there, I'll tell you where it went. Then it was this, you know what? Can we just what did we call it? We had a name for it. We called it a dinner club. We just said to them, we're like, hey, we'd like to hang out with you guys. Are you okay with that? And they're new to the neighborhood and we're new to and it was genuine. We didn't, can we get together in the summer months every 2 weeks? One time we'll come over to your house and we'll bring dessert. You'd make the main. And we started off at our house where, my wife made the main, they brought dessert. And that's literally how the friendship began.
Yeah.
And it really was just this. And I'll say this, is even as we went through the exchange Bible study with them, and I'm a pastor too. So I just acknowledged some of the hey, we're neighbors first. And I just said that to him. I said, I just want you to know up front, I am your neighbor. I'm a Christian first. I'm your neighbor second. I'm a pastor third. I just want you to know, no matter what we do with this Bible study, I'm still going to be your friend and we're still going to hang out for supper club just because we like you guys and I think you like us. And so that's literally how it began. And then
so you're sitting at these dinner club, which by the way, way better than a book club, in my opinion. A book club is boring, but a taco club, I mean, I'm down for that any day of the week.
Taco Tuesday.
I need to start some food clubs in my neighborhood. But so you're sitting down with them, and so you had this idea, and how many times did you meet with them before you were comfortable saying, hey, by the way, we're Christians, or how did that even go? How did you get them down the topic?
Yeah. They had different religious background experiences, vastly different. And I just said to them, I said, guys, I think it would really help your growth. They had a great marriage. I said, I think it would just help you guys on the spiritual side, the God side, if you will. You guys have so much in common. You have the same shared passions, the same shared desires, same shared goals. But when it comes to the God piece in your life, I really think you guys need to get on the same page together as a couple. And I said, here's what I would like to do with you guys. I'd like to, we do our dinner club. Why don't, and instead of ending it at the end of the summer, why don't we just keep doing? And we switched it just because of the work schedules for everybody. So once the school season started up, I said, let's not do dinner. Let's just do dessert. Let's do dessert and coffee. And let's do the Bible study together. And so it took us, we didn't get it done in 4 weeks. I mean, it took us a good, probably two months between work schedules, sicknesses with kids, all that to finally get it done. But to see them both trust in Christ, absolutely. And that's not been the standard operating procedure of how we have built relationships. That's just the latest one. Prior to that, it was coaching basketball teams and having all the families over to our house. And then in those contexts, it was just having conversations and kind of jiggling relational doorknobs and seeing where God was at work. And, to use language that we use here with the exchange is right when you find out that you're at a soul level conversation. So what is that soul level conversation? What I have found soul level conversation to be is there a relational issue at play? Is there, even to the initial conversation I was just talking about, are there differences in religious understanding or religious beliefs, faith beliefs? Even to the point with, I'm thinking of another couple now. So I'm telling you a different story. And that couple, she was an atheist. He was culturally Buddhist. And walking through the exchange and that, where one of the things I told them is there was a lot more conversation of how we got to soul level conversation. It wasn't just, hey, you two need to be on the same page, but it was like, hey, before you just write God off, why don't we actually consider, who Jesus is and what he's saying. So I just went down a lot of differing level conversations. Yeah. But George, even I'm thinking about a basketball family that I love dearly, that I have not done the exchange Bible study with yet. It's been 10 years we've maintained the friendship, and God willing, sometime in the next few months, I know our families are going to get together, and I have the relational capital with him now. That's not the standard. I wouldn't say wait that long for everyone by any means, but that's how it worked.
Yeah. I mean, I think it takes time, and different amounts of time. Just depends on the person, where God is in drawing them. But so it sounds like to me, like your kids were a tremendous inroad to the community. And then sports, so many Christians look at sports like such an evil thing or a distraction or not the main thing. And I actually know of you, and I know of another pastor, Tim Potter, who sports was one of the main inroads into the community. You want to talk more about like how kids are an inroad to the community and other things like you would recommend about sports and how people can like jump into, I don't know, Little League or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that there's any magic. I'm trying to think through. I would just say this: if it is not by accident that if you are a Christian and you got put on that team, that God is at work. God is at work everywhere. And so then it's up to us to kind of move those relational doorknobs to see, is this the family God's at work with? I don't know. Is this the family God's at work with? And how do we do that? We do that through conversation. And we're not dropping God's name the very first conversation. But man, as soon as someone talks about, my kid got bullied on the bus this past week, man, how did that make you feel? How did you respond to that? Right? All of a sudden, they're trusting you with a level of information that has moved beyond the soccer game or the basketball game. And you know that this friendship now is at a different level. So they've given you leeway to continue the friendship. And so it's very, for me, I'm not going to hide. Hey, I went to church this past Sunday, and man, I just found it so encouraging. And so those little pieces of conversation, practically, what did it look like? And as a coach, instead of having the year-end party, we always did a party early in the season and at the year-end. And that early on was just, we called it team building for our little league baseball or little league soccer or basketball. But it wasn't just team building for those kids. It was relationship building for my wife and I to figure out where God is at work with individuals. The bus stop has been huge. The bus stop, especially for elementary kids, man, our bus stop, you get there and
this is a school bus stop.
George, I'm going to start. I feel like I'm fighting back tears here just for a second. This is my wife. She just led one of our Muslim neighbors to faith in Christ 2 or 3 weeks ago. How did that start? It started at the bus stop. That's 7 years in the making. Wow. 7 years of my wife inviting those moms into our house after the bus left. They would come over for coffee and something for breakfast. And it was my wife and 5 or 6 other moms. It wasn't a Bible study. It was just, let's get together as moms. And over time that kind of dissipated. But the relationship individually that my wife was able to keep up now, here we are 7 years later, and there's been lots of Jesus conversation. But just recently, she trusted Jesus as her Savior.
By the way, that story's on our blog at the Exchange. It's a pretty incredible story. Tara working with this lady and the ministry of hospitality, the ministry of persistence and prayer, and over years, and worth it, man, worth it to win. Yeah. It's very hard. I mean, so like, because your kids aren't in elementary school. So did she like these relationships must have started when she had a kid to take to the bus stop, and then they continued. Wow.
Yeah. And I just feel, I mean, honestly, even in sharing these stories, it's like holy ground, right? It's where God is at work. So I don't share any of these stories in any way to point to me, my wife, or anything like that, because these are God is at work.
Yeah.
But even with now we're middle age. But now here's what I find. Here's where I think where God, hopefully, I think God is moving us relationally in building relationships in our community. Is now we're on the other side. Tara and I have now taken the approach of trying to be the aunt and uncle, maybe not to those little kids, but to their parents. Right? They're in their 20s. We're in our 40s. And here's what I think a great a good aunt and uncle do? They're just going to cheerlead and be the best encouragers to those young parents. And I just know that the people that are the most influential in my life have been the people that have been the most encouraging and have affirmed areas where they have seen either growth or grace in my life. And so if we see common grace in our unbelieving friends in our neighborhood, I'm going to stop right there and say, hey, listen, I just want you to know that is being a really good dad. What you just said right there about your wife, that's a good husband. Keep it up. Or that's being a really good boyfriend. Keep it up. And all of a sudden, when you start affirming, no one talks like that in our culture.
Yeah.
And so if you can affirm, not for manipulation, but out of a genuine authenticity, that genuinely was being a good dad or a good husband. Well, we want more families like that in our culture. But in doing so, then there's a greater open door. There's an open door now for greater ministry down the road.
Well, that's awesome. Well, before we close this out, I think one of the most important things that we just touched on is, we don't take the credit for any of this. I think that's one of the primary distinctions between King Saul and King David is towards where Saul went wrong is he not only made his agenda more important than God's in how he handled the Agagites, but he took credit. He took the glory. And David was humble and knew the credit belonged to God. And so we should never take God's credit. And it's a dangerous position to put your ministry in, to put your life in. And so God's favor is on those that are humble. And so we know all of this is done in God's power and grace, which is also relieving because we don't have to try to do something that only God can do, which is a formula for disaster. But instead, we're just on our knees waiting for him. So, well, Pastor Joel, man, thank you so much for joining the podcast and giving us of your time, sharing your story.
Thank you so much. This is a privilege. Thank you, George.
You got it. Well, guys, we will see you next week and hoping to introduce you guys to Pastor Brad next week and looking forward to his story as well. Lord bless you. We love you guys. See you later.